Well, perhaps it goes without saying, but people who design our homes influence our lives. Architects, innovators, or people who impose their ideas on the rest of us. A great design, you see, can encourage us to move with the times and adopt healthier, more efficient habits, so it is said. But if the industry is dominated by one race, one culture, how does that impact on society? Does diversity in architecture actually matter? You're watching Roundtable. I'm David Foster. Well, even the architecture industry itself is now admitting there's a diversity problem within its ranks. So what, might you say? Does it really matter who designs the structures we live in, we work in? We went out onto the streets of London to find out.
The British architecture industry has a diversity problem. Nearly 94% of British architects are white and 75% are male. Should there be more diversity in architecture so it can better reflect society and empower the people that live in it?
So if you bring in people with a greater spread of knowledge and a greater spread of experience, that's only going to have a positive impact.
The buildings of London paint a picture and tell a story. Although it might not be your story if you're from a black or minority ethnic background. According to research, there's widespread racism in architecture. Josh Fenton is studying at the London School of Architecture and believes there's a lot of nepotism, favouritism and prejudice.
If you're not perceived as looking like an architect or moving as an architect moves, then there's already this assumption that how is this person going to play out?
24% of black and minority ethnic architects have been victims of racism in UK workplaces. Josh's work experience has been relatively good compared to his BAME colleagues.
I have seen, for example, one of my BAME colleagues pulled up on a really minor infringement of company policy where there was, let's say, another colleague from a white background who was doing the same thing day in, day out over the whole year that I was there, and it was seemingly fine.
With clear misrepresentation in the industry, how does this affect the communities that live and work in these spaces? Tahera Roof is a young Bengali who believes having an understanding of different cultures is important.
Coming from a diverse background myself, having lived in social housing myself, I think I know what it means to live in there. I know what it's like. I know that I understand it. I know how it ticks. And I think my perspective in an architectural setting is invaluable.
The top architect firms are aware of what's going on around them and are now tackling race diversity. The president of the Royal Institute of British Architects says there's no place for racism, discrimination or unfair treatment. Mentoring and training programs have been set up for BAME architects. Tim Riley, an architect for 20 years, has seen some positive changes.
The change I've seen, though, particularly has been around more women in the practice rather than from a more diverse range of backgrounds.
Small steps for the industry, but the lack of diversity remains a problem.
It's not nothing that is going to sway me from continuing to be an architect. It's just it's there and it's in the background. You're aware of it.
It's a profession that prides itself on being a vessel for culture and humanity. Structures and buildings are a crucial part of a city's identity. Is the industry working hard enough to tackle racism? When will architecture better reflect the diversity of the cities we live in?
And with us for this round table, designed not by an architect, but by somebody who knew the table simply had to be round, we have Harbinder Singh Birdi, Senior Partner and Head of Infrastructure at Hawkins Brown Architects. Harriet Harriss is here, an architect who teaches at the Royal College of Art. She says the industry needs to become as diverse as the rest of society. Elsie Owusu here is the principal of her own architecture practice and was the first chair of the Society of Black Architects. She says she has experienced discrimination in the industry. Also here, Vinesh Pomal from Tate Hindle Architects. He's also on the board of the Young Architects and Developers Alliance, an august body, all of you, if I may say so. A diversity problem. It came up twice in that reporter's package. Mostly male, mostly white. We're talking buildings, we're not talking people here. Where's the problem? Somebody start. Harbinder, off you go.
Well, I think we all live in the built environment, and most of the built environment is designed, well, actually a small proportion is actually designed by architects, but it's very much informed by people within the construction industry. And I do feel that, you know, if you look at the sort of gender split, it's 51% female, 49% male. If you look at sort of, I think London, I don't know what the stats are, but just in terms of sort of non-whites, it's almost like 40, 60%. And I just think that the environment that we live in has to be designed by the communities and the people that live in those places. And I think if it isn't, then I think there's a slight imbalance. Particularly now, more than ever, most of our clients, especially in the public sector, are asking us to engage and consult with the communities. And I do think that there is sort of value in actually having people from those communities who are engaging and consulting in the building or the environments that they're creating. And because they've lived and breathed it. And I think if that's not happening, then sometimes I can imagine communities will probably ask the question, well, actually, like, how do you know how we should be living? How do you know what we've actually been through?
I can relate to that. So I design a lot of housing creating mixed communities instead of generations, and they often ask for separate living and dining spaces. Now, architects love, as I'm sure you're aware, open plan living, but actually some residents from different cultural backgrounds require separate spaces, and I've grown up living in that, so I can actually empathise. And one of the key skills of an architect is to have empathy.
Can we get on to architecture in the latter part of the programme and talk architects here and whether they do face discrimination? And looking at this survey, we've got between 45 and 60,000 architects in this country. This was a survey of 900 people, 1/3 of whom were black, Asian, minority, ethnic, so that's 300, 1/4 of whom said they had experienced discrimination in the workplace. That's 75. How can we say there is discrimination in the workplace based on 75 people out of perhaps 60,000?
But I think we need to look at other statistics as well, because I agree that report isn't necessarily...
It's the one that got all the headlines.
Naturally, and I think it's an important report, but it is only a sample. I think the bigger picture is that the working population, 12% of the working population of the UK is BAME, but only 3% of the construction industry working population is BAME. So at the moment, compared to other industries like medicine and law, that have done enormous amounts to make sure that they're more equitable, and there's good pay and fairer pay for women and also BAME employees. The construction industry is really lagging behind, and yet we are a growth sector. So at the moment, for example, we're worth £110 billion a year to the economy. 10% of the UK population works in the construction industry. That's 3 million people. But by 2021, we're going to have 160,000 job shortages within the construction industry. So we need to do something to think about how do we address that using the talent that we have in the UK, particularly with Brexit looming potentially, to enable people from diverse backgrounds to enter the profession and grow the sector.
Elsie, you want to be the next president of the Royal Institute of British Architects. You'll know in the next week or so whether you will be in 12 months' time, but you're having a monumental row with the organisation at the moment, part of which is to do with your claims of racism.
That's right. And I wouldn't call it a monumental row exactly. I would
say it's got so personal that they've sent you a letter saying you can't talk about certain things for legal reasons. A cease and desist letter
from my friend Kerr Robertson. But I think that it's an old organisation. It was started 185 years ago, and there have been, and so there is a culture which I have typified as that of a gentleman's club. Now, I have no objection at all to gentlemen's clubs. You know, the Garrick is a club, the Athenaeum is a club. I belong to the Athenaeum. But I think that the thing about RIBA is that it's a gateway into the industry for a lot of young people from black and minority ethnic groups.
And is it actually preventing people from going in?
And the statistics, not the ones that you've got, but the statistics that RIBA itself has, shows that there's a 95% dropout rate amongst black and minority ethnic young people.
During their first year?
No, from it's a long training. So from one end of the training, from entry point to entering the profession, for every 10 young people, that enter the profession, one person.
But could I postulate, and I'll ask all of you this again, it could be simply because it's very long, it's very expensive, and it's very difficult, that 9 out of 10 people are going to drop out, whether they're black, white, or whatever.
No, but the dropout rate for BAME students is disproportionately high, and there are many reasons for this. I mean, partly structural racism. So, for example, average BAME families in the UK earn £9,000 less a year than white families. The cost of education, therefore, is a barrier, a racial barrier by implication. But also, for example, we have a challenge in higher education at the moment about the, if you like, the colonial curriculum. So we're having incredibly big conversations about how do we decolonise pedagogy and curriculum to make it more about...
Could you put that in English?
Well, okay, so, for example, the traditions of universities in the West have traditionally favoured Western knowledge and Western expertise at the disadvantage and discreditation of knowledge from elsewhere.
I really don't understand how that affects architects.
Well, if you're a black student, for example, you're looking at learning architecture and you realise it's the architecture of mainly white blokes, you might not think that it's relevant to you in terms of what you want to do. You might not feel that you have a place within that
Well, I suppose on the other hand, you might think, well, now's my turn and my chance to go and change all of that, isn't it?
Well, I think, if I can add to that, I think the dropout rate amongst women is also very high for very similar reasons, in that architecture for the last N number of years, and the profession of architecture is probably about 500 or 600 years old as we know it, has predominantly been occupied by men. So that's what the culture that's been brought up, and we're trying to change it. So it's a big thing to try and change. It's a big task.
Vinesh wants to...
Costs are a big thing, as Harriet's picked up. And the biggest change that's happened is the government's fault. They've scrapped maintenance grants, which for many BAME architects from different backgrounds, they relied on. I relied on that maintenance grant to get through university and working part-time. So I'm not sure how people today, with the high tuition fees and with the high cost of education, of architecture education, field trips, all of that stuff.
Harbinder,
it adds up.
Your turn now, because I'll ask this question. Are we seeing here a call for reverse discrimination, in which black, Asian, minority ethnic get more favourable treatment than they're getting at the moment, perhaps at the expense of other students?
That's not what we're
But we're talking about maintenance grants which have been scrapped and bringing them back in.
We're also talking about social mobility. Yes. And this isn't a one-issue conversation. It's about black and minority ethnic people who also are women amongst those and are also from socially disadvantaged background. So there's a whole nexus, there's a whole mix of things, and what we're trying to do is to change the architectural profession so that it's accessible to people from all backgrounds.
Yes.
You were quoted as saying that there is a Harvey Weinstein-like problem with sexism and racism in the industry at the moment. I will ask you to respond to that in just a moment, if I may.
Yes, of course.
But do you recognise that sort of description, Harvey?
I mean, I'm just thinking about my journey. I've been practicing now for 20 years, and I actually did, I mean, I graduated from Manchester and I did a year out in India. You know, what was interesting is that my father, who's an engineer, when I said to him I wanted to become an architect, and this is like 30 to 28 years ago, he was saying, well, actually, there aren't many Asians in the industry, and if you look at my brother did pharmacy at Leicester University, where he studied, 90% were Asian. Now, actually, one might say, well, actually, why aren't pharmacy schools turning around and go, actually, we should have more white people doing pharmacy? I don't know if that debate has ever happened. But if you look at the generations that moved to the UK from India and Africa, what they did was that they typically pursued professions like accountancy, law, medicine, etc. So what they wanted was those sort of noble, stable professions where there was a need and where there was status. You look at migration into America in the 1960s. We've opened up an office in LA, and I was talking to an Indian architect there, and he goes, well, my father was an engineer. The Americans only ever took in Indians who essentially were scientists or PhD students because it was a space race. So there is a change now because there are more and more minorities within the profession, but there's a lag. And I think there's a lag of 20 or 30 years. And I think there is, my brother, who's a pharmacist, his daughter is now going to study architecture. And he sat me down and he said to me, what's it like?
Is it worth it?
Is it worth it? And I'm saying yes. And it's interesting because she now is seeing more and more people of colour in their profession as role models. And I do think that makes an impact. And if you look at our architectural education, first you have to get into university, then you have a 3-year degree. Then you actually have to go into the market and get a job. So someone has to employ you. Then you have to go to another university and do a 2 years master's. Then you have to get another job. So there are so many loops to go through. I can sort of see why, if you fall out of one, it's difficult to get back onto the journey.
And maybe that's partly why the government at the moment have been working really hard to change the training programme for architecture. So they've invented a new apprenticeship scheme, which they hope to have 3 million placements in by next year. They have what's called T-panels, which is sounds a bit like a tea towel, but T-panels are the kind of new name for vocational training programmes, which allow people who want to learn on a more skills-based rather than academic way, construction industry skills and qualifications. So I think that we are trying to do something about it. But to come back to the point about the RIBA, we have not exactly a Hippocratic oath, I wish we did, but we do have a charter that sets certain expectations around professional behaviour. And I do wish that organisations like the RIBA would set some metrics over what is acceptable ways to practice, what quotas could look like.
Well, OK, let's come back to Elsie on this one, because I was quoting you. It was having said there were Harvey Weinstein-like tendencies when it comes to sexism and racism.
Yes, and
that is taking it to the nth degree.
And the use of non-disclosure agreements, which is the particular point that I was trying to make. And this was one of the problems with the whole Harvey Weinstein revelations, was that people were subject to non-disclosure agreements, and the breach of that was technically an offence. And but
my point is, you used Harvey Weinstein, you talked about sexism and racism, and you applied it to architecture.
Yes.
Whether it was just simply it wasn't just the non-disclosure.
I'm not trying to.
How can you say that?
Because my experience of the profession in general, and of RIBA in particular, and even being a council member myself, and when I raised these issues, I got a threatening letter. And I was asked to apologise to the person who sent me a threatening letter on the basis that I'd spooked him, in quotation marks. And so the tendency is to try and close discussion down rather than open it up. And we have experience from the London Met, the Metropolitan Police, who have opened themselves up, who have changed their practices, and who've become more open and inclusive.
Let me ask you a question.
So why not architecture?
You talked about council members in RIBA.
Trustees.
OK, 13 of them or something?
No, there are 63 of us.
OK, well, there's a group of 13, I think.
There's a group of 12. You're talking about the board.
I am talking about the board, 9 of whom are apparently now black and Asian minority ethnic.
No, there is nobody on the board at all who is of a black and minority ethnic background. 63 council members. I ran a campaign with the Stephen Lawrence Trust, which resulted,
this is what I was reading
resulted in 9 new members for the first time in history.
Of the 63?
Of the 63.
Then the paper I read was wrong.
Well, you mustn't believe mustn't believe everything you read in the papers.
Let's switch this round just a little bit and talk about architecture rather than architects and the architect's body. Vinesh, you talked about the fact that you felt not enough attention was paid to the fact that certain groups of people might live in certain groups of housing, and therefore it would need to be applied to them. It isn't at the moment. How do you go about that? It's so jolly complicated, isn't it?
It is. So in my previous practice, I worked with a colleague she lived in France, and we were talking about the design of residential buildings and there being too much glass. You all know what happens when there's too much glass in buildings. It burns cars, like the walkie-talkie, for example. And she was saying, why don't architects in this country have shutters to prevent heat getting into the properties and provide a sense of privacy? And that really opened up discussions of the whole practice and changed the way in which we approach our windows. Open plan living, we all love open plan living. But certain cultures and certain backgrounds need separate living spaces. Not everyone knows that.
Can I just make a point? If you're a very wealthy person and you employ an architect, that architect becomes your friend. They practically, if you're not careful, will move into your house and live with you in order
That's what happens, is it?
if you're not careful, if you don't understand.
Yeah.
So the relationship between, the best relationship between an architect and somebody who's going to use the building or the space that they make is a very close relationship and is based on understanding, empathy, and like. Now, that can happen. There are 44,000 members of RIBA, most of whom, 50% of whom, are sole practitioners. So there's a capacity there for any number of small practices, any number of architects to work with as many people as are interested in working.
How can diversity...
And we can facilitate that.
How can diversity change for the better the architecture that we see?
Well, frankly, it's about representation. If we don't have enough architects who are diverse designing for society, then we won't remain relevant, we won't remain innovative. At the moment, there was a survey done last year that identified 65% of people think that the products and services and spaces that are being designed for them aren't really meeting their needs. They're not relevant to their lives.
Isn't that because architects design for themselves?
Not all of them. That was the tradition, and in some cases that was, I think, idealised previously. But I think we learned, particularly after the Latham report in the 1980s, that we need to communicate better and listen more. And I think this idea of moving in with you, although we might not necessarily want to do that with you today, that intimacy.
Why have I been that unpleasant?
I'm not sure about that, but the intimacy, we're onto the Weinstein list already, but basically the intimacy that architects have with their client, that connectivity to understanding them, that empathy, which has been described, is so key to understanding things. I think, and I also want to make a point about why diversity is important. We're not here, I don't think, to just talk about the fact that there are problems and there's obviously challenges we need to overcome. We need to look at diversity as being about the bottom line. McKinsey report last year identified that boards of companies that are diverse are 93% more likely to increase return on investments. We know that if we have diverse architects working with diverse communities, we get greater stakeholder buy-in from those communities, so people are less likely to think that the spaces they live in don't meet their needs, as Vinesh was talking about. We also know that what we end up with having is more innovative and relevant practice going forward into an uncertain economic future in this country. There are all kinds of reasons, but sometimes if it isn't ethics that can win the argument, then maybe economics can, because we know that being diverse will increase our productivity, not just in terms of our sector, but nationally as well.
We have sitting at this table somebody who aspires to be and may well soon be the President-elect of the Royal Institute of British Architecture. Would you like to make a suggestion to Elsie about how she could best change it regarding the subject that we're talking about, which is the inclusion of diversity within architecture? What should she do? What should she push for?
I think what we need to do is maybe make sure that there is an appropriate path. And in a way, you almost need to capture people. My wife's a primary school teacher, and you almost need to capture people when they're sort of 8 or 9, as in like the careers advice that you get in schools, in terms of actually going into with open eyes. So, for instance, now there is a new apprenticeship model. There's an apprenticeship levy that is being sort of levied on all firms, where essentially if you pay a wage bill of over 3 million, you actually have to pay 0.5% of that to the government. So now lots of companies now are incentivized to take on apprenticeships. Eventually you're going to have doctors who are apprentices. Now, architects now there's a new apprenticeship model. So you can become an architect, working in a practice 4 days a week, studying 1 day a week, and within 8 years you're a chartered architect. And we've just enrolled on that course. So what we'd like to do is actually take people, and rather than actually having a 7-year course where you're studying and you're paying a debt, you're actually earning as you're learning. So it goes back to how people learned architecture about 200 years ago.
How I studied to be a journalist.
Yeah.
Exactly the same thing. Vinesh, your suggestion?
The biggest issue is access to the profession, and this idea of unpaid internships are allowed in the profession. It doesn't happen as often in the UK, but the RIBA is a global institute, and it does have in its charter that if you're working for RIBA chartered practice and you're not being paid, you should report it. So I would like Elsie to make sure that's enforced, encourage students and architects to report that to RIBA and get it action, because it reduces social mobility, it reduces people's ability to actually access the profession. It's such a big, important issue which I haven't touched upon.
And at the end of the day, are we going to get better buildings in this country as a result? Not what Prince Charles, we all know what he said. He talked about carbuncles of modern architecture. But are we going to get better buildings, and what is a better building?
I think you will get better buildings, because essentially, as architects, it's not our building, it's actually your building. So if you look at Sadiq Khan, all the metropolitan mayors in Manchester, Birmingham, etc., their biggest challenge at the moment is housing. And what we're doing is that we're having to redevelop communities, communities that have been there for 20, 30, 40 years. What we're having to do is densify those areas, and they become quite contentious. And those people that live in those communities, they're saying, you're moving me out, then you're moving me back in. What say am I really going to have? And all the mayors are grappling with this. There is mass urbanisation, people are moving to the cities. And the architecture that we design, the places that we design, have to reflect the communities that live there and not change them. And I don't think one type of architect or an architect from one city will be able to sort of respond to what is a very, very complex problem. What you need is a group or a collective or a collaboration in your studio of people from that place that can respond to what that place needs.
If I may direct the final word to possibly the future president of the Royal Institute of British Architects, what's going to be the first thing, if you get the job, when you're in position, that you would change?
I would try and change the culture. The first thing I would do is to cap the membership subscription so that people who are, particularly small practices, who are paying a great deal to be part of RIBA, don't get an increase this year, so that we share the burden with the practices, and I think that's the only way in the first instance.
And what about changing the look of Britain?
Changing the look of Britain? Well, when you say architecture, I don't think it's just about architecture. I think it's about the whole designed environment, because architects are involved not just in buildings, but the built environment. And in order for the built environment to reflect the whole culture, just like...
You're talking about outside space as well, and how cities are designed, etc.,
and if you look at the England football team, for instance, they reflect the culture of Britain. Whereas if you look at architecture, architecture doesn't.
And final question to each one of you, would you all still want to be architects?
Absolutely.
Yes, yes.
Anything else, yeah.
Yes?
Sure.
Yes? Okay. Well, perhaps in the future it won't take quite as long, but a thumbs up for the profession, if not some of the things that it's actually doing. Thank you all very much indeed for coming in. We will read the papers. We'll perhaps hear from you, Elsie, if you do become president. Give us a shout. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Thank you for taking part. From me, David Foster, and the team, goodbye for now.